is pilgrims of hope, as we're all called to be. Our guest speaker tonight has been a pilgrim of hope for over 33 years, bringing a message of hope to so many people around the world. It's lovely to have Therese with us, because even since she retired from UNICEF, she still continues to be a pilgrim of hope for many people. Therese, a local Carlow woman, which we're so proud of and so happy to have with us tonight. And so I'd like to welcome her now and invite her to come forward. Thanks.
Thanks. Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much, and thanks for inviting a girl from the top of the town to come over the bridge. It's been, it's very nice. Yeah, to Father John, the committee, and the sisters for having me. I'm not so sure about a great pilgrim of hope, but I think hope is a universal language, no matter what country you go to. Everybody hopes for their children, and working for UNICEF has been a privilege to see that. A lot of people know me here. I see people I went to school with, people from the locality. I was born and bred, went to St. Catherine's and St. Leo's, learned my public speaking from Sister Augustine and Sister Anya, so if I mistake tonight, you can blame it on the nuns. But I think also what I got from growing up in Carlow was a community, what social justice is all about. And also, I was brought up in a time when in school we were taught to be curious, and critical thinking was very, very important to us. And I think that's really, really important as you go into the broader world to look at things. So what got me from the Crescent or the fruit shop in Carlow to thousands of miles away in Lesotho, which was the first country I went to? And it was probably really a sense of adventure rather than anything noble. I have to admit, it was sort of, oh yeah, let's go and see what I can do in Africa and how it would be. But one very important lesson I learned with the group I went with, which was APSO, which was an Irish skills sharing program, was that it is about sharing your skills. It's not about going across to do your own thing and to just do something and leave. It's about leaving something, and leaving those skills is like leaving part of you behind. So that was really, really important to me, because through the 33 years, my job was always to work myself out of a job, which, you know, not many people have the opportunity to say, well, I can't go back because there's no job for me. So that's a kind of a nice way to look at it. But before I start, I guess there's one word I've got to get into the open, and that's the word toilets, because that's what I did. We can talk about water and sanitation and hygiene, and really what I did all my life was promote the importance of toilets throughout the world, because even today, 2.1 billion people don't have access to toilets and improved sanitation. And the importance of that to children and child's health I'll talk about later. But for the purposes of this, I'll really refer to it now as sanitation. So I'll sanitize sanitation just for a more comfortable chat tonight. As I said, Lesotho was the first country I went to, and Lesotho really was very like, I suppose Ireland was in the 1950s. The majority of the men worked in South Africa in the mines, huge amount of migrant labor, with women and children left behind. Apartheid was still in South Africa, so there was a lot of difficulties within the country. But yet, you go to the most rural village, you go to the most isolated, up the mountains, any place you went to, people had hope. They wanted a healthy child, they wanted to get their children educated, and they wanted for them to be happy. No different than a child growing up in Great Cullen today. Everybody has this hope, and everyone has this aspiration to make the future for their children better. After Lesotho, I moved on to a country called Zimbabwe, and Basically, in Zimbabwe, I went out to deal with a drought. There was a widespread drought, so I was working on water initially, and then I went on to look at sanitation and hygiene. If you remember, at this stage, the equivalent of 3 plane loads of children under 5 were dying every day just due to the causes of diarrhea alone. Luckily in Ireland, it's not something we have to think of because we have good hygiene, we have good water, we have good standards, even in the 70s and 80s. But I was so interested in it, I looked back on it, and in 1964 in Ireland, 40% of the population in Ireland didn't have toilets. We can easily forget. Like nowadays, we have 2 en-suites, a downstairs toilet and a main bathroom. But you know, it's not that long ago. I was born in 63, so in 1964, 40% of the people didn't have access. So we've really got to sort of see how development can happen, and it can happen very quickly. But in order to develop, there has to be knowledge and there has to be skills brought in. And I always say that probably the best education I ever had was sitting under trees listening to mothers and grandmothers talk about things, rather than a master's degree for here or a bachelor's from there. It's really about sitting down, understanding people, understanding what they want, what they desire. I could build toilets, it wasn't a problem. Would the toilets be used? Would the behaviours change? Would children's lives improve? That was ultimately what we needed to do. And in order to do that, you had to have social change, not just building buildings and putting in pumps. After Zimbabwe, I had my first real, I suppose, encounter with a major emergency, and that was Mozambique, a massive cyclone. People may remember a little girl called Rosalita being born on a tree and being rescued by herself and her mom by helicopters. It was a major, major cyclone, just came in off the Indian Ocean, washed the country apart. People who were sitting quietly one day suddenly had their whole world gone the next day. They had to run to higher ground to save themselves. They lost a lot of people. But yet the hope of a better day, the hope of a brighter future remained there. I was very lucky in the fact that, well, I don't know if it's lucky or unlucky, I left the day the cyclone hit, and by the time I got back to Ireland, there was a ticket waiting for me to go back, because a lot of the work I had been doing was on water-related diseases, and the pictures we had developed and the pictorial work became very important for that recovery, because following the Civil War, literacy rates in Mozambique were very, very low. So it was quite an interesting process. But the point I'm making is each country is different, each subdivision of a country is different. How you approach things remains quite common. You approach it as a human to another human, as somebody who has hopes and aspirations to a mother of a child who has hopes and aspirations. Working for UNICEF was very easy because it's such a noble mission. I mean, who doesn't want to enhance the lives of children? And I was very lucky to be working for UNICEF for so many years. But after Mozambique, I kind of made a little bit of a dramatic change, and I have to admit it was one that my mother probably wasn't too happy about. I went to Afghanistan. And just after the Taliban finished in Afghanistan in December, I flew out in January to join the team there. And it's probably been one of the most rewarding journeys I had, because there was such a sense of joyous hope. The refugees were coming back from every country. Everyone was returning, wanting to rebuild the country. And this is where, for me, the most important aspect was trying to get girls, obviously, back to school. So my focus was making sure we had water and sanitation and facilities at schools to get girls back into the workforce. But when it comes to language and how you relate to people and what happens, I flew into Kabul one morning, quite jet-lagged, and the team, there was only Afghani team there, and they said, oh, we've got to get you out, you've got to go out and see. And I went out to a school, and the only person that had English in the school was a young boy of about 12 or 13 who had been a refugee. And he was doing the interpretation for me, and then he kept saying to me, where are you from? And I'd say, Ireland. And he kept saying, UK. I'd say, no, Ireland. So we were sitting there anyway, drawing little maps, and he turned around and he says, I know, Roy Keane. And I just thought, there is, no matter where you are, if you try, and I mean, they always talk about Irish people making a connection, but I think all people can make a connection if you try hard enough. And I still remember that young man who went on, graduated and became an engineer actually, and started to work for government. Unfortunately, he and his family had to leave with the latest takeover by the Taliban. So sometimes it can be very positive, but then sometimes you go back again and you sort of think, how life can be difficult on people. He finished being a refugee at 13. At 32, he was back a refugee again. So it's always a very difficult situation. From Afghanistan, and I mean, it was very hard to leave Afghanistan in many ways because there was so much to be done, and my main aim was to get girls back to school, but also female staff into our office. And, that we managed to do, which was lovely. But then I moved to Ethiopia. They used to joke in UNICEF that you could follow my trail because any country that had very little toilets was where I went. So they used to sort of map my journeys as to where there was fewer and fewer toilets. And poor old Ethiopia, when I went into it, 8% coverage of toilets. And we're not talking about flush toilets, we're talking about outdoor toilets, any kind of a toilet. So there was really, really high levels of diarrhea and trachoma there, so it was a huge amount of work to be done. They have in Ethiopia what they call the green famine, so you can drive out. It's a vastly beautiful country, stunningly beautiful country, and it looks very green. But actually, there's no crops and there's no harvest. So it can be very, very, it'd be like going out here and you see beautiful lush green, but it's actually nothing you can eat or nothing you can cultivate. So you really have to be careful how you judge a country. But in Ethiopia was where I started to work initially on menstrual hygiene. We had quite an interesting journey on that because, as you can imagine, the water and sanitation sector is quite male-dominated. And we had an emergency. We had a flooding area, and I said, what are we going to do for the women and girls who were moved? And they said, what do you mean, what are we going to do? We don't do anything. That's not our job. And you sort of think, okay, we can put in a bucket, we can put in soap, we can put in a toothbrush, but we don't put in any menstrual products into a hygiene kit. So luckily now I can proudly say that that now happens in all emergencies, So I think that's something that's really, really important. Another big part of my work in Ethiopia, and I think it's really important to say at this stage that when you're out working in the country, you're working with governments, you're working with other agencies, but like a lot of our time and energy goes into trying and make sure not just the skills, but that there will be plans for improved water and improved sanitation for the next 20, 30, 40 years, whatever length it takes. And that's called advocacy, and it's trying to get government budgets changed, it's trying to get investments in. I'm sure here in Carlow, if any of our councillors or TDs got up to talk about sanitation, most people would switch off, and it's no different in any other country in the world. Water and roads will definitely get priority, but without improvements in water and sanitation, you just don't get the improvement in child health. Globally, we've been so lucky. In the last 3 decades, under 5 mortality has dropped by over 70%. You know, unbelievable. And that's all due not just to vaccines and the improved nutrition and the improved health, it's improved water, improved knowledge of mothers as to how they care for their children. And really, you know, when you look at, as I said, 3 loads of children under 5 dying every day in the 2000s, if we don't keep up our investment, if we don't keep up our commitment to water and sanitation and other elements, we will end up back where we started. So I didn't just do that in New York. They kind of brought me to, or in Ethiopia, they sort of brought me to New York and asked me to try and get sanitation and hygiene onto the international agenda. So we worked very hard on that, and hopefully, you know, we started with 2.1 billion people not having access. Today, 1.2 billion don't have access. So in the last 20 years, we've seen about 900 million people getting access to improved facilities, which isn't enough. We need to do much, much more, but at least there's progress. Conscious of time, even though Father Johns did say he wanted to get value for money out of me, so I'll take another 2 minutes if that's okay. I also worked on a lot of the emergencies, so the Haitis, the Yemens, the Syrias, earthquakes, floods. But I think, you know, the hardest thing of all for me, and I think for many people who work in the sector, are the man-made disasters. And just listening the other night, a report by one of my colleagues, and it was something I had forgotten, and that is the silence of hunger. I mean, it strikes you the first time you see it, and that is, you walk into a community and you don't hear children crying, you don't see children playing, and it's basically because they have no energy to do so. And for that to have been induced by another human is incomprehensible to me. And I think, you know, we really have to look at where we're going, you know, as individuals, as a world, as a community, when we sort of allow a child to go. It's bad enough to allow a child to go hungry one night or through no fault of our own, but to actually have in entire populations getting access and children getting access to food is wrong. And I don't think, you know, the silence of hunger should be not our silence. You know, we should say, yes, I am here for children. I will advocate for children. I will do everything I can. Because it doesn't matter where you are or who you are, a child is a child. You know, every parent has the same hopes for their child. And the hope of a mother or a father or a granny or a granddad shouldn't be that my child will survive until tomorrow morning. It should be that my child will grow up healthy and happy, and that we're doing everything we can. And I think as a global community, the onus is on us. Because often we talk about refugees and how difficult it is. The top 3 countries with refugees at the moment in this world are Jordan, Pakistan, and Ethiopia. And Pakistan and Ethiopia would be countries that on their own have their own levels of poverty and deprivation and people that need to be supported. And yet they have hundreds and thousands. I spoke to a friend yesterday because I was involved in the Rohingya crisis. You may remember a few years ago, the people all coming across the paddy fields between Myanmar and Bangladesh. And I helped to build those camps 6 years ago. Still today, there's 1.2 million people in the very same camps. But the TV cameras have gone, but the hopes and aspirations of the mothers in those communities still remain. So thanks very much for listening to me, and thank you very inviting me, and it was been a pleasure.